Over the course of the past several weeks, we've explored a number of competing ways of being human. Now it is time for you to decide where you stand and why. This video will review the debate and help you formulate your answer. Your answer should, first of all, take a clear, well-defined position on the question. Avoid harmonizing. Be clear enough that at least some people are likely to strongly disagree with you. Second, your answer should demonstrate an understanding of the history and current state of the question. This means that you need to demonstrate significant knowledge of the various ways we have studied in this course. You should not just summarize all the various religious and secular traditions we've explored, but you should situate your position in relation to at least one other position that you believe you are close to, and one with which you sharply disagree. The strongest papers will engage more than two traditions. Finally, defend your position and answer relevant counter-arguments. Let's talk a little bit about this final point. This has been a whirlwind course, and in all fairness, we've spent more time exploring the ways than we have analyzing and evaluating the arguments behind them. Still, a strong paper will explain why you hold one position rather than another, and not simply appeal to your upbringing or your feelings. What kind of arguments are appropriate in this context? Those rooted in the disciplines we discussed in the first week of the course, even if at this point you are just attempting those disciplines and cannot be expected to have mastered them. First, you might make hermeneutic arguments based on the interpretation of texts and other cultural artifacts which you find authoritative or compelling. But you cannot simply assume a naive or literal interpretation. Try to situate the text in its historical context and figure out what it meant and how it functioned socially to the people who produced it. You might also make a narrative argument in which you demonstrate that the story you prefer is large enough to contain and contextualize competing stories. This is especially appropriate if the principal text from the tradition you prefer is itself a story. By a story in this context, I mean a specific story, such as the Charis origin myth, or a specific version of the Christian story is told in a particular gospel or in one of the authentic letters of Paul, not the story as you grew up with it. But again, you can't just tell the story, and you should not assume a literal interpretation. It is a question of what the story says about what it means to be human and how we realize our end or purpose. Social scientific arguments may also be relevant. Here you would assess the historic impact of the traditions you are examining. This is the kind of argument we made with respect to the origins of Israel. It is the kind of argument that Marx makes in his Critique of Religion and that Weber makes in The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. Finally, you can make philosophical arguments which start with credible assumptions and use logical inference to demonstrate a particular thesis regarding what it means to be human. You might also make theological arguments which use philosophical methods to explain and render credible the messages of the stories told by the various traditions. Now let's turn to the ways themselves. We looked first at what we call primal ways, such as totemism and the Charis religion. For the most part, primal ways view the universe as an organized, meaningful system of which humanity is an integral part. As human society develops horticulture, this harmony is understood in increasingly dynamic ways, and humanity is increasingly understood as a participant in the creative process of the universe. There are no formal arguments at this stage, but we do often get compelling images and stories. Can you find yourself, for example, in the Charis origin myth? Why or why not? For sacral monarchic ways, the universe comes into being and is sustained through warfare and sacrifice. Think here of Tezcatlipoca's song, or of the Vedic stories of Purusha. Humans become divine by means of conquest and by conducting sacrifices such as the Rajasuya, which deify them. Again, there are no formal arguments at this point, mostly images and stories. Can you find yourself in Tezcatlipoca's song, for example? We should note, by the way, that there are modern and postmodern variants of this worldview, which can be evaluated based on empirical evidence and logical argument. Consider, for example, Nietzsche's claim that the universe is essentially a war of all against all, in which everyone inevitably loses. The axial ways differ from the primal and sacral monarchic ways in their conviction that something is fundamentally wrong in the world, which must be healed and transformed. They share a common aim of spiritual cultivation, though they understand this very differently. For the ways of wisdom, the phenomenal world is largely an illusion. What is really real is being, the good, Brahman, or the web of interdependent origination, in which all things subsist in relation to each other. By cultivating wisdom through dialectics or contemplative practice, we become detached from impermanent phenomena and become, by way of just action, connatural with the creative power behind the universe, being or Brahman, or by way of compassion with the web of interdependent origination. Here we find numerous dialectical arguments, such as those advanced by Plato, Aristotle, the Vedanta tradition, or many Buddhist sutras. But note that image and story are still in play. Consider, for example, Plato's allegory of the cave. In these traditions, we also find claims to direct, experiential, non-conceptual knowledge based on contemplative practice. For the ways of harmony, the universe is naturally harmonious, but has fallen into discord. Humanity is called to restore that harmony and ripen being. We do this through force and law, for the legalists, through universal love, for the Mohists, through study, ritual, and contemplation, for the Confucians, or by yielding to the Tao, for the Taoists, or perhaps by some combination of these. Most Chinese sages made informal arguments based on examples of how their tradition encouraged health, inner peace, and more harmonious social relationships. The ways of liberation and justice share a common conviction that the fundamental problem of human life is oppression and injustice, and that we know God first and foremost in the just act. We saw many different expressions of this way. For earliest Israel, it meant a peasant revolt, followed by creation of a revolutionary communitarian society in which land was held collectively by the villages and periodically redistributed among families in order to ensure a rough equality. For later Judaism, it was about living justly in an unjust world and increasingly becoming a catalyst for justice. For emerging Christianity, the struggle for justice was a losing battle, which ends inevitably on the cross, but also finds fulfillment in connaturality with God, both in this life and in eternity, outside of space and time. Islam finally returns to the demand that we actually create a just society by joining justice and power, by commanding right and forbidding wrong. For all these traditions, because of their strong socio-historical focus, narrative argument plays a central role. The story of the Exodus, exile, and return for Judaism, the story of the Incarnation, crucifixion, and resurrection for Christianity, and the story of the revelations to the prophet and the Islamic liberation of much of the Mediterranean basin and Western Asia for Islam. But all three of these traditions have syncretized strongly with Hellenism and make ample use of philosophical arguments as well, both to establish the existence of God and show how the demands of justice embodied in the tradition were not dependent on special revelation and are thus binding on all, and in order to show that even those of their claims which are not rationally demonstrable are credible and not in contradiction with reason. Protestantism, which we have characterized as a theistic secularism, represents a transition from these axial ways towards the ways of civilizational progress. Here the story of Jesus is told not so that we will emulate him and be transformed, but rather as evidence that God has paid the price for our sins and offers us salvation as a free gift, provided we join ourselves to Christ in faith. We are then called to live out our faith in the world. As Max Weber pointed out, especially in the case of Calvinism, which taught that God predestined some to salvation and others to damnation without respect to any foreknowledge of their merit, this became a powerful catalyst for capitalist development and industrialization, as people looked for evidence of their election and their degree of usefulness to society. While there are arguments to be made for the Calvinist reading of the Scriptures, a great deal of the power of Calvinism historically came from this association with emerging capitalism and with the Industrial Revolution. Technocratic secularism carries this trend further. As the scientific revolution progressed, humanity became less and less convinced that God was necessary to explain the universe, and more confident of its own ability to push back the limits of finitude. The result is a range of perspectives from relatively sober and pessimistic new atheists who see humanity as a temporary island of meaning in an ordered but ultimately meaningless universe, to advocates of the Omega Point theory who believe that humanity will eventually be able to re-engineer the universe and build God. Here, of course, the arguments in question are first and foremost scientific. But just as it is important to avoid naive literalism in interpreting religious texts, we also need to avoid naive scientism. We may not need the idea of God to explain the emergence of complex organization, life, and intelligence, but science, strictly speaking, does not even ask the question of why there is something rather than nothing. Humanistic secularism finally aims to push back the limits of contingency by creating a political subject which can make humanity the master of its own destiny. For liberalism, this is the property-owning or rationally autonomous individual. For democracy, it is the people as a body of citizens, and for populism, the people as ethnos or nation. For communism, finally, it is the working class. Here, the relevant arguments are philosophical and social scientific in character. It has recently become fashionable to regard all these grand narratives as merely attempts by one or another social interest to advance its position. Postmodernism dedicates itself to deconstructing these grand narratives, but then it does so in the name of an ideal, justice, which cannot itself be deconstructed. This is a complex field with many players and many arguments. I don't expect you to decide now, once and for all, where you stand, or to come with fully developed and polished arguments. But surely you have some leanings, and surely this course has helped you understand better where you fit in the debate. I look forward to your answers.